Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Marukian.
And I'm Roger Moriano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Roger.
Maria, I'm telling you.
Wow. We just had the most enlightening, just lightning conversation with our guest. And I can't wait to share this with people. So we just interviewed Elmer Dixon, who is the author of Die Standing: From Black Panther Revolutionary to Global Diversity Consultant. And Elmer is one of the founding members of the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party. He now, half a century later, continues to do that revolutionary work in different ways with companies, organizations, universities, and a lot with children, it sounds like, educating young folks. He's been a guest lecturer. His book tells his life story as a way to instruct future social justice activists on how to organize and engage in community building so that we can actually develop successful strategies for achieving change. And God, there's so much that we talked about today as he was sharing his stories and what he experienced as a young man that resonate, because it really feels cyclical to what we are experiencing today, which I guess doesn't surprise me, because you think about that word revolutionary, right? And revolution it's cyclical, right? I mean, the notion of a revolution is going around. And so part of what was really resonating with me as I was listening to him share his experiences and his perspectives is that this work of being revolutionaries is in it and of itself a revolution, right? That we're constantly, there's no sequential timeline that goes from point A to point B. It is a circle, and we just keep going around and hopefully, expanding the circle and making progress, but the work doesn't end. So what really caught your attention? What resonated with you from our conversation with Elmer?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Maria. And, Angela Davis has talked about, freedom being a constant struggle. And I think, Elmer talked about this in his conversation with us as well, which is the reality that the work never ends because of the systems that we live under, because of a system in many ways, economically, politically, that is set up in ways that rewards winning over others, right? Achieving individual aims, oftentimes at the expense of community. Because the system is set up in such a way, there will always be folks that are going to be affected by those systems. And so that work will always remain. And I really found it really impactful to hear Elmer talk a little bit about, being a 16, 17-year-old and imagining what the work will look like, and now being, in his 70s and still seeing some of the same exact issues existing and how difficult that must be, but also clearly is keeping the fire lit within him to continue to do the work. And I know for me personally, as a young professional, I was once interviewed for a newsletter about the work. And I think I naively said something that I hope in 50 years my work becomes obsolete. And now that I'm well along in my career, I'm finding, as Elmer did and so many of us do, that it is a constant struggle, that the work will never go away. We can do everything we can to improve things and to make things better, but as long as we are existing under systems that rewards winning over others, there will be folks that will be exploited or taken advantage of, and left to situations where barriers, sometimes insurmountable barriers, exist. And it is up to all of us to identify those situations, identify those places and spaces where folks have barriers, so we can do the work to remove those barriers, dismantle the systems that are creating the barriers, and really achieve the end goal of ridding our society and our globe of one of the greatest tragedies in existence, which is having human beings spend their entire lives, however short or long, just trying to survive rather than living out a life of a contribution, a life of feeling respected and valued, and a life where I feel like I lived for a reason rather than just trying to survive, right? So we all have that responsibility to create that world, and Elmer certainly has been a part of it.
Yeah. I often tell folks that my father was a history teacher in public schools and in high school. And I would love to have seen my dad and Elmer down and having a conversation, because the richness of the stories, and not just because they're personal to Elmer, but also the way in which he presented history in such a frank and honest way, with that observer lens, but also with heart. It really struck me, because I kept thinking about how anytime that I was complaining or, talking about something that was happening in the present day, in our society, in front of my dad, he would always say, to understand what's happening today, you have to go back into history. And then that would usually preface like 2 hours of him lecturing to me. But I think what's so important about that is, if we are unwilling to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to the fullness of our shared history, we cannot make progress forward, and we hold ourselves and our society back. It doesn't just hurt the people whose voices and stories are marginalized and silenced. It hurts all of us. And so I think what really stood out to me in Elmer's storytelling and in the book that he wrote is that this is a guide, right? This isn't just a collection of narratives. This is a guidebook, a process by which we can take action from wherever we sit, whatever identity group we belong to contribute to the kind of society that's going to be in the best interest, not only for us and our generation, but the generations to come. So I could go on and on. I think we definitely have to have a part 2 through 7 with Elmer, because I know that there were so many stories that we didn't get to hear. But I really hope that listeners take the time to listen to this full interview, because it is powerful and empowering. So thank you all, and hope you enjoy our conversation with Elmer Dixon. So welcome, Elmer Dixon, to the Culture Stew podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
First question, for our listeners to learn a little bit about who you are and why you are. When you think about some of the messages that you received early in your life that have really shaped you and your identity, your sense of who you are, how you show up in the world, what are some of those messages that continue to reverberate for you?
Yeah, I like to preface that question, or preface the answer to that question, by saying that, and I tell this to kids, young people, when I'm talking to audiences, is that the things that are happening around us and to us by people that are part of our lives, we or not, we don't know the impact that they're having on us. We don't know how we're shaping and molding, but all of these things indirectly and sometimes directly really shape who we are. In 1955, I was born in 1950 in the same neighborhood that Emmett Till was born in and lived in. My dad grew up in that neighborhood in Inglewood in Chicago, and Emmett was murdered when I was 5 years old. Of course, I don't remember that. I do remember some years later, I don't know how far, that my father had written a poem upon the death of Emmett that was published in a local Black community newspaper in Chicago. We were living in Champaign at the time. And so certainly that's something that was in my psyche. My parents always made sure after we moved out here to Seattle and were old enough to sit down with them and watch the news, we knew that they, for example, were pulling for Kennedy, because Kennedy was a ray of hope in the Black community. And they made sure that we, when we watched the news together, we saw Bloody Sunday, we saw the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which happened when I was 13 years old. We marched with King when I was 11. But I often tell people that I grew up in an era of assassinations. Kennedy in '63, Medgar Evers, the Cheney and the other two civil rights workers who had traveled to the South. Of course, the bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Later, when I was 15, Malcolm X, the insurrections in Detroit and Watts, they're mistakenly and deliberately so called riots. And all of these things, were impacting me, and I didn't know to what extent. And it was when I was 17 and heard Stokely Carmichael, who was the national spokesperson for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was the person that first launched the phrase Black Power. That we need a Black Power movement, and it was through his words, talking about the fact that Black people don't have freedom because they don't love themselves. We hate the fact that we're Black. And initially, I kind of took that as a Black versus white thing, in which it was not, because I had my two best friends were white. But after I let it soak in, it dawned on me that I am Black, and I am proud of it. And that was where that change shifted in my identity at 17. But all of those things that I mentioned were inside of me. The other things that were happening, of course, is the way that our parents raised us. My father joined the Army with his buddies in 1941, not waiting for the draft, because they wanted to defend and fight for this country. And when he was assigned to a little town in Mississippi, he thought he was going to Missouri. He found out that when they got there, that of course it was an all-Black infantry, but they were told not to leave the base because there would be problems. But they were young, 17, 18 years old, or 18 by this time, and they wanted to get out on leave after they had been drilling so hard, and riots erupted between them and the people of this racist little town. When they were marching off to war, people were spitting on them and calling them cowards and the N-word, rather than the flying confetti and the American flag, as you often see in movies. But none of those things colored how he saw people. My mother had early experiences as well. Her actually growing up a part of her life in Mississippi. And you can imagine in 1930, she was born in 1925, as a 5-year-old in a little small town in Mississippi. But none of these things colored how they saw people. They always reinforced what King taught for us, to judge a person by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So they had an eclectic group of friends that they hung out with and did stuff with. They did. My brothers and I had to polish the floors and the hardwood floors for a Friday night event, when they rolled back the carpets and pulled all the furniture back, and 20 or 30 of their Scandinavian friends would come over and do loud Scandinavian dancing. And by the way, while we were waxing the floor, my dad was playing La Boheme and Madame Butterfly and the Tales of Hoffmann, which are operas. And so we're all opera lovers, all four of us kids. And they had friends that were Jewish. We went over their home for Passover. Had my first matzo ball when I was 12 years old. So I had this very multicultural upbringing. In fact, we lived in a melting pot neighborhood, and I had friends across the whole spectrum. So this was preparing me, unbeknownst to me, obviously at the time, to actually become a member of the Black Panther Party, because the Black Panther Party had a multicultural platform, unlike the lies that people are told that we were a racist and separatist organization. That was not the truth at all. So all of those things came together to not only shape who I became as a Panther, but years later as a diversity consultant.
Elmer, thanks for that. And, so many questions swirling around in my head, but I know in your book, you kind of reference a little bit about that time in high school, right around that 15 to age 17 period of time, when you first started hearing about the Panthers and you were starting to have those awakenings. Can you talk a little bit about how you learned about the work of the Black Panther Party and how it impacted you at that crucial developmental part of your life?
Yeah, the Black Panther Party was started in Oakland in October of 1966. So um, by the spring of 1967, which is when we heard Stokely Carmichael, we had been hearing through news reports, as an example, when they marched on the Capitol in Sacramento, some some rumblings about the Black Panther Party. In fact, I think we had gotten a hold of my brother, who was a year older, who was enrolling at the University of Washington that fall of '67, and ended up, along with Larry Gossett, starting the BSU at the UW. He's the one that turned me on to Stokely. We talked about the Black Panther Party. These cats look like they're serious. Um, so there wasn't a lot of influence other than the fact that we knew that they were taking direct action. And I ended up becoming the co-chair of the Seattle chapter of SNCC that summer following Stokely's speech. And that fall, I, along with several of my classmates, started the first high school Black student union on the West Coast of the United States. So we had some, I don't know if it was disenchantment with SNCC, but we weren't feeling like we were making a difference or doing anything that was really affecting change. Voter registration, in Seattle, in the Black community in 1967, we didn't even have any Black candidates that we were, that we were supporting, and so or candidates period that we were supporting. It was just getting people registered to vote. So that there wasn't, there wasn't really any targeted action. So this idea of reading about these cats in California who were causing a ruckus, we were curious, and we were wanting to know who they were and wanting to know, how they were acting. So it was, it was there, but we weren't able to do anything much with it at that point.
I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more, Elmer, on some of the challenges or the barriers that you faced as you went further and deeper into the work of the Black Panther Party and really focusing on action toward racial justice. What were some of the barriers that you saw back in that time? And maybe also, how do they compare to what we're experiencing today?
But you have to remember who we were. When we met Bobby Seale on that night in San Francisco at San Francisco State University, he was giving a powerful speech, and he was very angry. I often tell people not to get this image of the angry Black militant, because that's not who we were. We operated out of a love for our community. But Bobby was angry that night because he was preparing for the funeral the next day of little Bobby Hutton, who was the first member to join the Black Panther Party and the first to die, who was brutally murdered 2 days after King in the streets of Oakland while in police custody, shot by 20, 30 police bullets as they shoved him forward and claimed that he had a gun because he hadn't stripped all the way down naked, as Eldridge Cleaver had done and had asked him to do. And so he was very angry, and we went over to Oakland at his invitation, and immediately as we crossed the Bay Bridge, saw hundreds of young Black men and women in military style formation in leather jackets and berets. And I remember my first thought was, this looks like a Black army. When we got into the church, the walls were lined with, again, leather jacketed and beret members of the Black Panther Party. The party had grown overnight after the murder of little Bobby Hutton. And because it was a local organization at that time, they only had one other chapter outside of central headquarters. They had the Los Angeles chapter. And when we told Bobby that we wanted to start a chapter of the Black Panther Party, we became the first chapter outside of the state of California. But in that funeral, as I was walking by little Bobby's coffin, and Mrs. Hutton, like Mamie Till, wanted to have an open coffin, even though he had been riddled with bullets, so that the community could see what the police had done to her son. And I remember walking by and looking down at little Bobby in this coffin that was draped in a Panther flag, and he was in his uniform, his leather jacket, his beret, his powder blue shirt, his Free Huey button. And I remember looking at him laying there at 17 years old. He was dead, and I was 17 years old. And I remember thinking that that could be me lying there. And it was at that moment that I and others, my brother, as we had that same experience, realized that we were ready to die for the people. So we had no fear. We didn't have the normal kind of like, so what are the obstacles, as other people do when they think about movements today. We were ready to build a revolutionary movement. And if I say the obstacle was the United States government. And that summer of 1968, J. Edgar Hoover named us the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States. And they launched an all-out effort to destroy, disrupt, discredit, and murder us, which they began doing. So the biggest obstacle, was making sure that we weren't murdered while we were in our offices asleep. So we had 24-hour guard duty in our offices. I had 2 bodyguards at all times. So the obstacle beyond the biggest bully in the world was organizing in the community for people who were asleep, who hadn't woken up yet. How were we going to organize? And so that's why we launched what Bobby taught us was the 10-10-10 program, a way that we could do grassroots organizing block by block in the Black community. We didn't see those as obstacles. We saw those as challenges and opportunities to grow.
I mean, incredibly powerful testimony there. And just, I think it puts into perspective the realities, the harsh realities that people were facing, that were committed to racial justice, and the realities of the dangers and risks that were involved, and just fighting the narratives that were being put out there about the Black Panther Party and the work that was being done, and labeling folks as radicals or, as terrorists and so forth. But quite to the contrary, the Black Panther Party really was and spearheaded many of the ideas of what community work should look like in serving the needs of communities. And tell us a little bit about the Panther Survival Program, some of the programs that were in place, particularly the free breakfast program. Now, you also mentioned in your book that the Panther Party and all that were involved in terms of the mission and the work that folks were involved in, and the revolutionary acts that were involved. The most revolutionary act was giving back to the community. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that did for you personally, but also for the communities you served?
Yeah, it all began and is centered around all of our survival programs around the 10-point program and platform of the Black Panther Party. Everything emulates out of that. And you use the term, both of you, racial justice. See, that wasn't in our vocabulary at the time. In fact, point #1 of the 10-point program says we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. So we're talking about community control. We're talking about controlling our own destiny. We're talking about building a movement and challenging the status quo in this country. And each program of that we ended up starting, we started some 60 different survival programs across the country. We were not a social service agency. We didn't create social service programs. Huey had taught us that we needed to capture the hearts and minds of the people. We also learned that power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner, which meant that we had to look within our community and define the phenomena that were happening to us. The very first program actually was not a program in and of itself. Huey said the way that we define phenomena is by controlling our own perspective, our own language, our own story. And so he and Bobby started the Black Panther Party communal news service, intercommunal news service, which was the Black Panther newspaper, because we were not going to let the white established racist media define us. We were going to define ourselves. And so when he said we needed to make sure that as we were building this movement that people could survive America, we needed to have survival programs. The very first survival program that we started was the Police Alert Patrol. Often people go right to the breakfast program, but the very first program came out of point number 7 of the 10-point program that says we want an immediate end to the murder of Black people. And so we took direct action by arming ourselves with shotguns and law books. We understood the law. We understood how far away we had to stand from police when we marched out and we observed them. And we started these police alert patrols. That act alone triggered this kind of us versus them, the police and the Panthers, and triggered J. Edgar Hoover to call us the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States, because that direct action led directly to a decrease in the cities where we had these police alert patrols in the numbers, the incidents of Black people being shot by police, because we were there with a shotgun and a law book saying, you will not murder and kill this person. That was the very first survival program. We also were taught to do our research, and that research came through building this 10-10-10 program, where we were organizing and cut the community. And this came from Mao Zedong during the Chinese Revolution, when he was looking at building a revolutionary movement in China, dividing an area up into 10 square areas and assigning block captains who were in charge of organizing within those areas. And so while we were doing this, we learned that small Black kids were going to school without any breakfast in the mornings because their parents did not have the means to feed them. And so we took matters in our own hands and started the Children's Free Breakfast Program. Here in Seattle, we had 5 programs ultimately, and we ended up feeding 2,000 kids a hot breakfast every week. And that was directly in response to the fact that people's kids, these babies, were expected to learn on an empty stomach. And so we were ostracized by the establishment for doing that. In fact, some of our breakfast programs in LA, for example, were raided by police, trying to scare the children and terrorize the children and run them out into the streets rather than have a peaceful breakfast. But the kids always came back. This is how the government responds, attacking a breakfast program where kids are trying to get a free breakfast. Now, you tell me who the terrorists are. When we discovered that the infant mortality rate in the CD was the second highest, the Central District in Seattle was the second highest in the whole state of Washington, we took direct action. We went and met with Dr. John Green. He was a white doctor who was head of neurology at the University of Washington Hospital. And John said, so what do you want to do? We said, we need to start a clinic. And so he told us to pull a truck up to the back door of the University of Washington Hospital on a particular day and time. And when we rang the bell and the door opened, there he was with all of this medical equipment. He said, John, where'd you get that stuff? And he said, I procured it from the hospital. And so that was how we built our clinic. We didn't have to go ask for money. He assigned third and fourth year Black doctors, and some of them were in their internship and residency. They were assigned as their part of their residency or internship to the clinic, and he supervised them. So that's how we got a medical team in our clinic. In fact, that clinic today is this only still operating original Black Panther Party clinic here in Seattle, the Carolyn Downs Family Medical Center. So we took direct action, and as I said, we had some 60 different programs around the country. Some chapters had one chapter had a free ambulance program. We had a free legal assistance aid program here in Seattle, as did other chapters. We just a whole list of these programs, survival programs, so that people could survive the conditions within their community while we were building this revolutionary movement.
So there was so much work, obviously, and a great deal of progress in many ways made due to the work of the Black Panther Party, the overall civil rights movement, and fast forward to 2023. And I'm curious to know, there's a lot of people in our society that say issues of racial justice, attitudes toward race. I mean, we're better now, right? We've made so much progress, but then we see these polls that look very similar to the way that they did back in the 60s in terms of a majority of white folks, and in particular Republicans, people on the right, feeling that racism against white folks is actually the bigger problem in our society than anti-Black racism, and an unwillingness to even explore the notion that racism exists. In fact, obviously we're seeing a significant backlash even in terms of certain states eradicating that from our public education. And so what is happening, Elmer? How come we can't seem to make progress in terms of creating this connection between white Americans and the actual lived experience of Black Americans?
I saw an interesting I guess it was a TikTok something where it was a white guy talking, and he was talking about how white people have, and this guy's white himself, have attempted to turn the table, ignoring the facts and lying. He said white people lie. And of course, you don't take that in a pejorative sense, but those that are in power lie. The Republican Party lies, and so they lie to prop themselves up. And I was a EEO officer, and one of the things that I was responsible for when I was this EEO officer was protecting women against sexual harassment. And the two elements of sexual harassment that make it such a powerful force that primarily men use is the fact that it's, one, the harassment's about sex, and number two, it's about power. And racism is a lot in the same way, in that it's about race and it's about power. And I'm sorry, Black people don't have no power. And so to turn around and say that Blacks are racist, yes, you may have kids out there making racist a mark that may be racist, but they don't have any power. See, they can't do anything about to back it up. This country has continuously been part of a racist philosophy that has governed everything that we do, because it's intrinsic, it's systematic, embedded, systemized racism. And sexism as well. And so, perfect example, when we started our first clinic, the very first clinic that we started was a well baby clinic, in response to the fact that we had the second highest infant mortality rate in the CD in the whole state of Washington. That's because Black women then were highly susceptible, most at risk, I think it's called septemia or something, of dying during birth, or their children, or both of them. And so our response was to have this well baby clinic. And you'll remember that a month or two ago, an Olympic gold medalist, Tori, can't remember her last name, died in her apartment alone while attempting to give childbirth because of this exact same condition. Here we are in 2023, the exact same situation exists. And it's because her doctor did not warn her, wasn't even aware of it, or didn't care that she was at risk of dying because of Black women have a higher percentage of risk. That's because of the institutional racism in the healthcare system. And I could go down the list. It has been consistently that institutionalized racism has a negative, ongoing, lasting, lingering impact on Black and people of color. And so for the Republicans to sit up there and make this claim, that's like them watching Hawaii burn last week and saying climate change had nothing to do with it. So they look at it in the face, they see an island burn, Lahaina burn to the ground, and they lie and say, nope, it was, it's just natural. It was going to happen anyway. That's what this guy was talking about. They lie. And so to perpetuate their lies, I'm not through. To perpetuate their lies. So you got the governor down there in Florida who is putting in textbooks that Black people benefited from slavery. And that those textbooks went out and into the hands of middle school kids in Florida this month. So here we are.
I have many thoughts, but I know, Roger, this is something that you are deeply committed to and have a lot of experience around. So I want you to be able to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, Elmer, I hear you, and I just, obviously this is only scratching the surface of all the things that we're talking about, because with your comments in terms of the systems that have been in place since the beginning, that race, was a foundation for so many of these realities that we face. That's what's being trying to be ignored, right, or to be legislated out of our schools, and if people don't want us to learn that history. But race has been embedded from the very beginning. When the Declaration of Independence was written and when the U.S. Constitution was written, it did not intend to include Black folks, right? When or women, right? And when the Civil War began, that history has been attempted to be rewritten for well over a century and a half, right? The Southern schools for decades and decades calling it the War of Northern Aggression, when it's not a matter of opinion that slavery was the foundational reason for the Civil War. It was the Confederacy itself that told us that it was the reason for the Civil War. The vice president of the Confederacy stating that this is the first country in the history of the world based on the foundation that Black people are inferior to white people and that their only purpose in the United States is to serve white people. And so these ideas have existed for a long, long time, and they have been foundational. And when we hear folks say that racism against white folks is a greater threat than racism against Black folks, there is absolutely no data to support that, but it does reinforce ideas that have been present for centuries, right? It reinforces those notions. I know polling in the 1960s that was done by Gallup, in 1968, had white folks in about 58th percentile or so saying that Black Americans had just as many opportunities as white Americans to be successful, and a majority, about 70% of white folks, saying that Black folks were they themselves responsible for the conditions they found themselves in rather than the systems that they were under. So these ideas have existed a long, 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 long time. And so, in that reality, in the face of that, what would you say someone today who wants to continue or jump into the work, and as a young person is considering what can I do to engage in the work of Black liberation, of liberation for all human beings in our society, to truly have barriers removed so that I as a human being can reach my full potential and contribute my talents, ideas, skills, hopes, and dreams to the society in which I live? What would you say to folks that are wanting to jump in and do the work? What advice would you give?
Yeah, did you have something to add to that, Maria?
I wanted to add one thing, just an addition to that question, because I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that this isn't just a problem on the right of the ideological spectrum, but that
No, it's not.
Liberals, especially folks, counting myself as one of those representative, self-proclaimed of liberal, white, educated women, have a lot of learning and unlearning to do, and that quite often, sometimes unwittingly, liberal whites actually contribute a great deal to some of these challenges and continue to help perpetuate some of these the ongoing systems that are in place. So recognizing that everybody has a sort of equal role that needs to be played in terms of, as Roger was saying, getting in the game and helping to do the work. I just wanted to add that piece.
Yeah, when Bobby Seale, Chairman Bobby, came to Seattle to organize our chapter, in my mother's living room, She's 98 and still alive. Um, and he told us that we needed two things, to do two things. After reading the list of 19 rules of the Black Panther Party, he told us that we needed to read 2 hours a day and go to PE class, political education class, twice a week. And then he said the second thing that we needed, of course, was to have 1,000 rounds of ammunition and 2 weapons, because he said they're coming after you. And so when I share that, and when I talk to students, my focus largely, Maria and Roger, is on kids. And the group, the age group that I most enjoy, and that just lights me up when I'm in front of them, are the 1st through 5th graders. And I've done several of those elementary schools in the past 5 months. And these little kids, you should just see their faces. I've got pictures of them. And the way that I talk to them is not like when I talk to a high school or a university. I ask their teachers to make sure that they educate them on the reality of the Black Panther Party, and then ask me questions when I come in. And I remember a few years back, gosh, it's been 5 years now, when I did my first elementary school. It was over in Bellevue, bedroom community of Seattle. I don't know if you guys are in the Seattle area or not. And it was in a white elementary school, Spirit Ridge Elementary. And when I walked in the door, I started seeing these posters on the wall that said Panther Principles. And I said, God, what is that? And then I realized that it was their school mascot. I said, okay, settle down, don't get too excited. And I get into the classroom, and there's like 30 kids spread across the floor. This is a predominantly white school. Before I started, another teacher popped her head in and said, can my kids come in too? And I said, certainly. So another 20 or so kids came in. We had about 50 kids in there. And they're all down there on the floor. And I get into a chair where I'm like eye level with them. And hands go up. And this little white kid, couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and without any more energy and excitement mustered in this little body, he said, what was it like being on the police alert patrol? And I was just like blown away that this kid knew why we had a police alert patrol, why it was there, and was wanting to know what it was like being out there. And so these inquisitive minds, I tell these kids, and as I said, I've been in several elementary schools in the past 6 months. I tell them, first thing I tell them is, don't believe everything your teacher tells you. And the teachers acknowledge. And I tell them, make sure you or your parents get a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, and so that they can read it, because those things will probably fall on deaf ears in the right wing, but for liberal whites, read it. I don't know if you march or if you march in or celebrate Columbus Day. Columbus, one of the biggest racists and murderers of people in the history of the world. And so that's where you start. You got to educate yourself. You got to read history. You got to read true history. You got to look back and dig and understand that in the 1950s, when whites were fleeing the inner cities because they didn't want black people in their neighborhood, they went out to what was being called the burbs, which was being built and subsidized by the federal government. Subsidized. And Republicans are always talking about entitlement programs, like Social Security is an entitlement program. You see how that kind of lie is perpetuated. This was welfare for white folks, whatever money group they came from. just move out. But there was a clause as they moved into these suburbs, to the builders: don't sell anybody black or Asian or Latino. And so these communities built up and grew, and they had a large tax base because these people had good jobs. And so what happens is that when the federal government allocates dollars for schools, they look at the tax base. And those with the higher tax base get the better schools, they get the more dollars. So the kids of these recipients of government welfare were able to then send their kids to Ivy League schools and the best schools. While in the black communities and the inner cities and the Latino and black communities, they didn't get the same dollars. So they didn't get the same education level. They didn't get the opportunity to go to the best schools. They were funneled into junior high school or into trade schools so that they could continue to serve the master. And so you look at what happens years later, and you jump on top of that, the redlining that went on across the country, where people could not get, obviously move into better neighborhoods, but in the neighborhood they had, if they wanted to build those neighborhoods up, they were denied mortgage loans, second mortgages, so they could keep their homes up. And so it's a double whammy. You don't get the tax base, you can't properly educate your kids, and now you can't improve your neighborhood. So there's the finger pointing. It's those lazy ass black people. Look at them. They're on drugs. Their communities run down. There's a scene in the movie Godfather where the five families have come together after Sonny is murdered and Tatalia's son is murdered, and they're trying to call a truce, and they're all five families around the table, and the Godfather is opposed to the drug business, which kind of started this whole thing, this war between these families. And so the Tatalia says, okay, well, we'll do the drugs, but we'll keep it in the darks, meaning we'll keep it in the black community and the Latino community, which in reality is what happened. They funneled drugs within black communities. They armed the gangs in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, there was a documentary called The Fire Next Time on HBO, where the former leader of the Crips was in prison being interviewed. And he said, when the rail yards that passed through Watts, he said one night they went and saw these rail cars stopped. And he said he knew that normally the rail cars didn't stop, and they certainly didn't have anything in them when they did, because the rail people that had the rail yard knew that this stuff would disappear. So they went into the rail yard to look and see what these trained cars had. And he said when they opened the first set of cars, they had every kind of weapon you can imagine. So when you see movies of like hip hop kids with AK-47s and Uzis, where the hell do you think they got them? They were implanted by the CIA. And so all of this crap that continues to happen and has happened throughout history, people don't understand the depth of how we got here. And so when you ask the question, what can you do? Educate yourself. Go deeper than just the civil rights, Rosa Parks, and the bus boycott, slavery. You don't even fully understand slavery. A lot of white folks say, well, you weren't the only people to be enslaved. That is true, but we were the only people who were dehumanized in slavery. Less than a man. The 3/5 rule, or whatever the rule was, the Dred Scott decision. So look at your history. It's all there. It's been gradually covered up, but it's all there. If you understand the depth of it, that should strengthen your conviction. That should allow you to say, all right, so I got a lot of work to do here. We used to have whites guys come up to us and say they want to join the Black Panther Party. We said, no, we have a coalition for that. We started the first Rainbow Coalition, which that phrase was coined by Fred Hampton, who was murdered by the Chicago Police Department and the Alcohol, Firearms, and Tobacco agents, by the way, for launching the Rainbow Coalition. And so we said, you got a lot of work to do in your own community. You know, you got a lot of educating to do amongst the white folks who, one, claim that they're liberal, and then the ones that don't even want to hear it. So, your path in terms of what you can do, you can figure that out on your own. I don't need to tell you that, but I'll tell you where to start. You need to start educating yourself to the reality of this world, to this country, to how deep, the racism, how deep the oppression goes, how deep the systematic annihilation of the Native Americans, the systematic enslavement of blacks, and the ongoing enslavement of black minds after Reconstruction. Black Wall Street wasn't an accident. When the black community there in Tulsa, Oklahoma, built their businesses and their homes, and always were told, well, go build your own thing. So black people did. And then when a white woman falsely claimed that a black man whistled at her or touched her in an elevator, and she later admitted that she lied, they burned down Black Wall Street and murdered over 300 people. And that wasn't the only incident of its kind. This is the reality of this country.
It's a reality that goes contrary to every narrative I heard growing up, right? It's that so many Americans hear growing up. And I think that in order to get to a better place, in order to truly become the land of the free, we have to acknowledge, we have to admit, we have to attend to the realities that have made up the reality, the real existence, the real lived experiences of communities across the history of this country. And the resistance to that says everything we need to know about the willingness of leaders nowadays to really want to create the American dream or the American opportunity that we claim to stand for, or whether we don't, right? And so it's imperative that we hear voices like yours and others that are continuously teaching our young people the reality of what has existed, so that we can create the idea, that great idea that America was supposed to be for everyone, right? That has to be something that has to be attainable for everyone, but we can't do it unless we admit our past. You cannot treat a devastating illness or a devastating disease by failing to acknowledge its existence, right? We have to diagnose the issue accurately, honestly, and with conviction in order to move to a place where we have a healthier community for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I talk about these things, and it sometimes paints a dire reality and a dire picture. We are in dire straits. But I have a hope for humanity, that good people outnumber bad folks, but ignorance still reigns supreme, and we have to overcome this ignorance and this unwillingness to acknowledge our past so that we can face the future. But every time there's an attempt to do that, there's these jokers on the sideline, like that fool in Florida and his cohorts, to try to roll the truth back. This has always been the case. This is why we are probably in this situation that we are in today, is because someone is continuing to perpetuate this lie. And as much as I have faith in humanity, as I said a few moments ago, I put most of my efforts into talking to kids, to babies. And while I will speak at universities and continue to do so, my hope is in babies, the young ones. We are so, as a culture, used to being persuaded by other things in our lives. I watch America's Got Talent every now and then, and there's a lot of good people a lot of, a lot of fantastic people that are both in the audience and also in the among the performers. But I don't see people picking up the torch, and enough people picking up the torch and doing things. But there are people that do stand up for justice. There are people that do stand up for people's rights. There are people that care for one another. There's a lot of that. You just don't hear enough of those stories because they're there. If every now and then one of those stories pops out about someone who has a condition that the community comes forward and helps this person regardless of their color. So we know that there are good people with good hearts in this country. And so, we just need to continue to, and I think as I speak to you, Roger and Maria, continue to try to educate ourselves and influence people to do the good things that matter and not chase, the Bachelor or the Bachelorette on TV or, the Kardashians, come on, let's look at what's really happening, around us. And I think if enough of us, enough people can do that and grab reality, that we can see a shift. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime. I used to, when we were 18 and we were fearless, we said revolution in our lifetime, but we never believed that we would see our 25th birthday because we thought we would be assassinated. But we weren't afraid of dying. And now I'm 73 years old. I know I won't see it in my lifetime. But my hope is for these kids, these babies, that they will see it in their lifetime. I've got grandkids, all of them grown except for one, and I've got 6. Matter of fact, I think we added 2. We have 8 great grandkids. So in their lifetime, perhaps. And so that's what gives me energy. That's what keeps me moving forward. That's what helps me not to get discouraged, is to continue to work with these babies. And so you got to find something that gives you joy.
Thank you for that powerful call to action that I hope all of our listeners hear and take heed of, that all of us need to be willing to pick up the torch if we want to see that change in our lifetime, in the lifetime of our children and our children's children. So Elmer Dixon, it has been an immense honor to have you on and hear your story. And I have so many more questions for you. I think we need to have a part 2. But this was really incredible. And yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, we can have a part 2 because there's a lot of stuff we didn't get to, but let's keep talking.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.